Ukraine cannot win its war against Russia. The real question that we need to analyze right now is, can it avoid defeat, or is that also already in the cards? Is there any way to avoid that outcome right now? We have nobody better to help unpack this than international relations theorist and prophet at the University of Chicago and almost a sage on all things Russia and Ukraine, John MEARSHEIMER. John, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Danny.
Well, listen, this is a really important question because as you'll see in some of the clips we're going to play in a minute, there's still not a recognition that Ukraine can't still win. Actually, there's still a lot of fiction going on around here, but we're going to look at both what's going on politically, diplomatically, and militarily on the ground to see that things are not quite that rosy as people in the Washington want to believe. And that also goes for many in NATO as well. And well, for Kiev, I mean, we just got to keep going here. But the problem for all of this, and the thing that's just really anguishing to me, is the bill payers for all of this nonsense are mainly the Ukrainian people, the combat troops, their civilians that are in the state, and even the combat troops in Russia, because really, when you get down to it, it's between Zelensky and Putin, neither one willing to make what needs to be done to get this over with. And so these people keep dying in large numbers. And until we get that fixed, I think those numbers are going to continue to rise, which to me is just egregious.
I think the problem is actually bigger than that. I mean, you want to remember that Ukraine, according to a lot of reports, is in a demographic death spiral. So the long-term demographic consequences of this war are going to be disastrous. It's going to have really long-term negative effects. Furthermore, the country itself is going to be reduced in size. Who knows for sure exactly how big the rump state that will be Ukraine will be. But the Ukrainians have already lost a big chunk of territory. They're likely to lose more territory. So this war, although it certainly is horrendous from the point of view of all the Ukrainians who have died, it has other huge negative consequences as well.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I've mentioned periodically, is that the longer this goes on, the longer it takes to even start the process of recovery from what's going on. And all of the men who keep dying on a daily basis are the men that the country is going to need to help rebuild it, to build its future. And we're depriving them of that by letting this thing drag on. That's also egregious.
Yeah, I agree completely. This is a disaster. And in fact, it's in Ukraine's interest to try to end it as quickly as possible. And to go on fighting this war for years would just make a horrible situation much worse. And I'm choosing my words carefully.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are those in power today that are not following that dictum, that are not recognizing that reality. And we have to start at the very top. Here is a joint press conference between the Vice President of the United States and the President of Ukraine at the Munich Security Conference, where Kamala Harris says this.
The President and I, President Biden and I, will continue to work to secure the resources and weapons that you need to succeed. We will work to make sure Russia pays damages to Ukraine. President Zelensky, as President Joe Biden and I have made clear, we will be with you for as long as it takes.
You know, that just so anguishes me to hear that, because this whole phrase that they have been saying for a long time, as long as it takes, Biden at least changed it to as long as we can for a while, but now it seems to have gone back to the first one. But if there was any doubt about what he thinks, he said this, I believe, just today.
We have to stand up to Putin and pass the national bipartisan bill, the National Security Bill, supporting Ukraine as they defend themselves against Putin's vicious onslaught. And prove to the world once more, America can be relied on. We stand strong with our allies. We have to remember who we are. We're the United States of America. We keep our commitments. We never walk away from our friends. And we sure as hell don't bow down to Vladimir Putin.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to what he said there in just a second, because this whole thing about we never leave our allies, Ukraine is not an ally. So let's make sure we get those terms actually matter. But first of all, before we do, let's see what Zelensky himself is saying also at that same conference.
What would you say to your Republican colleagues in the United States? Anybody who's blocking that bill?
If Ukraine will be alone, you have to understand what will be. Russia will destroy us, destroy Baltic, destroy Poland, and they can do it Senators have to understand only in unity we can win Russia, and they have to understand that we will win with them or not. We don't have any other way. We have only one land, our Ukraine.
Okay, he's implying, actually, he stated there, if he doesn't get this funding from the United States, this $60 billion that's on the table, that they're going to lose. But the implication being, but if we get it, then we're going to, as he then subsequently said, they're going to win. So let's look at that first. Do you think that's accurate? Do they have a shot to win if they get $60 billion more dollars?
No, there's no possibility of them winning unless the Russian army shockingly collapses all of a sudden. And there's no evidence that that's going to happen. The Ukrainians are going to lose. And the only question is how much territory they lose and how many people will die in the process. There's two possibilities here. One is that the Ukrainians are basically able to hang on to the territory they now control and keep the Russians from gaining more territory. That's one possibility. And the other possibility is that the Russians continue to build on their recent success in Avdiivka and they capture more territory. Those are the two options here. And in both cases, the Ukrainians lose. There's just no way around that. And, you know, he and many Americans want the Ukrainians to sacrifice more. And you could make an argument for sacrificing more if there was a plausible chance of victory. But given that there's no plausible chance of victory, and we're only talking about losing big or losing rather big, it makes absolutely no sense to sacrifice more lives and create more damage and destruction in your country. The Ukrainians should cut a deal now.
Yeah, and so the question is you see whether it's the president, vice president, or the president of Ukraine, they're all still staunchly on this claim that we have to keep going. And I don't know, John, if it's that they're not aware that there is no military path to accomplishing the objective they're set out, or if I don't know if they have something else in mind that they still want to hold to this fiction that, hey, it's cool if the war keeps going on because it weakens Russia and it continues to do that. I'm not sure which it is, but it's troubling either way because I argue that earlier in the war, Russia was weakened and they were harmed and they were set back. But because the war kept going on, they have now recovered a lot of that and they're on a trajectory to end stronger than they began. So I think that we're on a path right now that's either going to lose or lose big, as you said a second ago.
Yeah, I think you're correct that the gap over time between Russian capabilities and Ukrainian capabilities has widened in Russia's favor. And as you project forward, the gap is going to widen even more. So I agree completely. Now, the question is, why doesn't the West recognize this and move to reach some sort of settlement between Ukraine and Russia? And I think the one factor that you're not taking into account that matters a lot is that the reputations of these leaders is bound up with what happens in Ukraine. You want to understand that this is going to be a stunning defeat for all the people. And as you know, there are many of them who have predicted all along that Ukraine could win, that Russia would lose, and this was going to be a great victory for the West as well as Ukraine. This is what they have been saying for 2 years. Well, if that doesn't turn out to be the case, and indeed Vladimir Putin wins, the evil Vladimir Putin, these folks are going to have egg all over their face. And more importantly, they're going to have lots of blood on their hands. So
John, it's like as though you're in, say, a living room, and someone just told you there's a fire in the bathroom in the back of the house, and you don't want to think about your house burning down, so you're going to keep the door closed and go, no, there's no fire back there, everything's fine. I got some water hose coming here, and we're not going to call the fire department, but no, it'll be fine because it'll be embarrassing. And then thinking the house is not going to burn down. I mean, that's where we're on a path to. You can't get away from this.
No, our house is not going to burn down. That's the point. We're the United States of America. We're separated from Europe by the Atlantic Ocean. We're the most secure great power in the history of the world. We're incredibly rich, and we're not doing the fighting and dying. The Ukrainians are doing the fighting and dying. That's why it's easy for American policy makers and the American foreign policy establishment and the mainstream media to tell the Ukrainians to keep fighting. If they had to go on the front lines and fight against the Russians, they'd change their tune. But as long as it's the Ukrainians who are doing the fighting and dying, they're willing to continue this fight in the hope that some miracle will happen. We will get a victory and end up with egg all over their face and blood in their blood on their hands.
Okay, well, fair point. As a matter of fact, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan kind of made some comment very much related to that.
They're going to keep fighting, but they're going to fight from a less strong position if they do not get the replenishment of ammunition, air defense interceptors, and other capabilities that they need to be able both to withstand Russian advances and to take territory back that the Russians are currently occupying.
So yeah, but the bottom line is they're going to keep fighting, but we got to give them the money. Now, of course, implied in that, and I think your point is very valid, that but maybe a miracle will happen, because yeah, if it doesn't, we'll just say, well, that's embarrassing. But anyway, moving on, because the Ukraine house is burning down all around its head there. But I guess also part of this whole fiction thing is this. I'm going to show you here a clip from Ben Hodges, former 3-star general. It just makes me shake my head. I'll let him speak for himself.
I don't agree that the Russians have the upper hand. Neither side can knock out the other. The Russians do not have the ability to finish off Ukraine. After 10 years, with every advantage, Russia still only controls 18% of Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet is losing in the Black Sea. The great Russian Air Force is terrified of flying over Ukraine. Russia has lost 500,000 soldiers killed and wounded and thousands of armored vehicles. I think Russia actually is in a very fragile state.
That beggars any kind of rational thought there, because there is probably some element of truth to nearly all those things that he just said, all those categories anyway. Russia has actually lost 6 aircraft here in just the last recent day, and that's an alarming thing for Moscow for sure. Russia certainly has lost a lot of people. They lost a pretty solid number going after Avdiivka, but that is not anywhere close to the losses on the Ukraine side. They don't even have an air force that can fly over the Russian side, much less worry about getting shot down. I mean, they haven't been flying hardly at all in many months, kind of thing. But all of the fundamental factors that I know I've heard you talk about many times that underpin what it takes to build national combat power are overwhelmingly, and as you said just a second ago, continuing to escalate in the direction of Russia. So it's just boggling the mind that we still hear our senior leaders saying these kind of things.
Well, there are a number of points that he makes that I just think are dead wrong. First of all, I don't think the Russians have lost 500,000 people. I think the number is much closer to 300,000. And as you point out, the Ukrainian losses are 500,000 plus. I would argue that in the final analysis, that for every Ukrainian who has, for every Russian who has died or been wounded, 2 Ukrainians, maybe even more, 2 Ukrainians have died or been wounded. So I think his numbers are wrong there. But just let's talk about air power. The fact is that the Russians have made a huge advance in recent months that's having a profound effect on the battlefield. And that is they have developed these precision-guided kits that they can tack on to dumb bombs and turn them into smart bombs. So what you see is that the Russian Air Force is pounding the Ukrainian forces on the ground and behind the front lines with smart bombs. And you also want to remember that when you use smart bombs, it's possible for the aircraft to stand off, 70 kilometers or more away and fire these smart bombs at targets. That means the aircraft are not very vulnerable. So what has happened here is not only do the Ukrainians suffer a huge disadvantage in artillery on the ground, they also now suffer a huge disadvantage in the air because the Russians have turned that huge inventory of dumb bombs into a huge inventory of smart bombs.
And as I understand, John, I think I've read also that the flight trajectory or the dynamics of the way those things come in is that they're very difficult to for anti-aircraft missiles to intercept, even if they had them. Which is why, especially in Avdiivka, there was a massive number of those things that all found the target.
Yeah, they're basically not defend. You can't defend against those smart bombs for all intents and purposes. And the Russians are just pounding the Ukrainians. They pick out fixed targets, and because these are precision-guided weapons, they can put the bomb in the pickle barrel, so to speak. And this is a huge problem for the Ukrainians. And again, as you pointed out, the Ukrainians have no air force. They're talking about getting a handful of F-16 maybe in June of this year. But that's not going to matter at all. It's going to be a drop in the bucket.
Yeah. And they're going to end up getting shot down as well. There's nothing magic about the F-16s, as our own pilots were worried about. Well, tagging off of something that Hodges said there, no surprise here. Budanov, they're basically the head of their intel agency, it was quoted in the Wall Street Journal, I believe it was yesterday, is saying that the struggle will continue on because he doesn't believe that the Russians do have the strength to achieve their goals. He thinks that they're running out of ammunition, which kind of we've heard before. But it's interesting that the others in Europe not quite having that same opinion. They don't think that he's right on that. And in fact, another article, I think that this one was today on The Guardian, that barely 10% of Europeans believe that Ukraine can still defeat Russia. Now, I think, John, that there's a reason why the Europeans think that, aside from, seeing these things that you and I do, but they also have knowledge, I think a little bit more than most Americans do, about the makeup of the Ukraine country itself, both on the ground and culturally, linguistically, et cetera, that they see playing out here. And I'm going to show you something from something that somebody said back in 2015 that was really smart. And if we'd have listened to him back then, things might have turned out differently. Here's how that went down.
This is the ethnic breakdown of Ukraine. I'm going to show you a number of maps, all of which are designed to show you that Ukraine is a badly divided country, and what's taking place inside Ukraine today is in good part a civil war. And to that extent, it doesn't have that much to do with what the Russians or the West are doing there. And as you can see in red are mostly Ukrainian-speaking people. And then as you move further east, you're talking about lots of Russians and certainly lots of Russian speakers. This is the Ukraine election of 2004. This is the election in the wake of the famous Orange Revolution, which I'll talk more about. As you can see, the country is badly divided between the East and the West. The Russian speakers in the East and the Ukrainian speakers in the West.
So it's almost, if you'd have been saying that like earlier in this show, people would have thought that's just something that you just said, as opposed to saying back in 2015, almost a decade ago. And it's interesting that last slide you showed there during that speech, during that lecture rather, is pretty close to what the line of contact is today. I thought that was interesting.
Danny, I want to make 2 points just on your comments over the past 5 minutes. First of all, if you look at public opinion polls in the United States, the Quincy Institute just did a poll. 12% of Americans, 12% of Americans think that Ukraine can win the war. It's just very important. You pointed out that 10% of Europeans think Ukraine can win the war, and the Europeans are losing faith. 12% of Americans think.
I actually missed that one. I did not see that one.
Yeah. So but what we're talking about here is public opinion versus elite opinion, and it's the elites who have a stake in the game because the elites have bet on Ukraine, and they're the ones who will have egg all over their face. The public is obviously going to think differently about the Ukrainians' prospects of pulling their chestnuts out of the fire because the public doesn't have a vested interest in Ukraine winning the way that the elites do. I just point that out. But I want to make a much more important point to you about what's going on here. And this has to do with Ben Hodges' comments. This is a war of attrition, right? It's a war where you have two armies standing toe to toe and really beating the living daylights out of each other. And the question is, which army is going to bleed the other army white? And it's not so much a war about capturing territory. That matters for sure. But what's going to happen here is at some point, one side, and this will be the Ukrainian side, will be worn down. And then it will turn into a war of movement, and the Russians will rather easily start moving westward. And if you think about what World War I looked like, after the war settled down on the Western Front in late 1914, you had a war that involved very little movement in 15, 16, 17. And then that all began to change in 1918, first with the Ludendorff offensives that the Germans launched in March of 1918. But then when they failed, the West, the Allies, the British, the French, and the Americans started moving eastward. And they moved eastward toward Germany because the German army had been worn out in the battles of attrition between 1914 and 1918. So what the Russians are smartly doing here is they're not placing a high premium on capturing territory, because
That's so important to point
getting
out.
out in the open and getting yourself killed. They're interested in waging a positional war where they use their advantage and firepower to wear down the Ukrainians. And of course, the Ukrainians were foolish enough last summer to launch a counteroffensive that resulted in huge numbers of casualties.
Which hastened that end, hastened the point to where they're going to get worn down.
Yes, exactly. The Ukrainian army is withering away, and they didn't have as many men as the Russians did to begin with, because the population disparity is 5-1 in the Russians' favor. So the Russians are just wearing them down. And slowly but steadily, opportunities are going to open up for the Russian army to move westward. And then you're going to see movement. But the fact that there's not much movement now is not evidence that the Russians are losing or that this is a stalemate. I think that's a misreading of the situation. I think this is a problem that General Hodges has.
Yeah. And then one of the reasons I wanted to show that clip from you from 2015 is because it showed the enmity really between the two sides here and how strongly they hold their position, which of course ended up resulting in the Maidan Civil War, which is what you called it. And I want to show a real quick clip from the same year that you made this from one of the commanders of the Donetsk People's Republic, talking there. And what you're going to see there literally could have been from earlier today, because it hasn't changed at all. Gary, if you can run that one.
Людям-то надо восстанавливаться. Денег нет. Страна молодая, заново все начинает. Вот и сильно помогает, чем может. Нам все равно с кем воевать. Это наша земля, мы сделаем все, чтобы ее освободить. Люди воюют до конца и...
And he's been proven right. In those years, he's continued to fight than the people of the DNR. That's why when I hear all this talk about, even from Zelensky, about that their objectives even were to go back to the 1991 borders, that means that this civil war that they've been fighting will somehow just cease to exist, and that those people in the DNR, like him, although he was killed in action later, are going to willingly come back into Ukraine, even if they are subjected. But I mean, any more than the Ukraine in the western part would welcome a Russian invasion in, these people are not going to welcome the Ukrainian army in. So that's not going to be, even if they had the capacity, I don't think that could ever work, John.
Well, I think, Danny, what you're going to see here you've already seen a lot of it, and you'll see more of it in the years ahead, is a lot of ethnic cleansing inside of Ukraine. And ethnic Ukrainians who are in Russian-controlled territory will move westward. And ethnic Russians or Russian speakers who consider themselves allied with Russia will move eastward into territory that's annexed by Russia. This is a tragic situation, because what you had in Ukraine around 1991, when Ukraine becomes an independent country, is a country that had lots of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and lots of ethnic Ukrainians who actually at the time got along quite well. As you well know, I wrote an article in 1993 that said Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons. And I made that argument because I thought that there might be ethnic conflict down the road between the Ukrainians, the ethnic Ukrainians, and the Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine, and that Russia would threaten to invade Ukraine. So I said Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons. All sorts of people said that there was no need for Ukraine to keep its nuclear weapons because the ethnic Ukrainians and the ethnic Russians and the Russian speakers all got along very well. And there was no problem here. And my hunch, based on watching the wars in the Balkans, and here we're talking about the disintegration of Yugoslavia, was that you don't want to bet a lot of money on that. And actually, and I'm sad that this happened, but it did happen, that over time, relations between the ethnic Russians and the Russian speakers on one hand and the ethnic Ukrainians on the other began to get more and more hostile. And the end result is that in 2014, after the events on the Maidan, you had a civil war break out in the Donbass. And that led to unending trouble, to include the present war.
Yeah. And that's indeed where we're still at right now. So the operative question on this episode that we talked about here was that Ukraine can't win the war, but can they avoid losing the war? So in the last bit of time we have here, I'm going to play another clip from your 2015 lecture where you said, here's what we could do at that time, which could have prevented the war and ended it from ever escalating, but to where it did. And I want to ask you if you still view that way, and is there still room for that negotiated settlement to come about? Here's what you said.
Going back to the status quo ante, before we got this foolish idea in our head that we could peel Ukraine away from Russia and make it part of NATO, make it part of the EU, make it more generally part of the West. We should work to create a situation where Ukraine is neutral, and it's a buffer state. Just to go back to my simple or simplistic graphic, depending on your views, right? This is how I think about European security. This is what you want. You want NATO to include France, Germany, and Poland. You want Ukraine as a buffer state, and then you want Russia on the eastern flank of that border state. And this is not what you want. You do not want a divided Ukraine where Western Ukraine is in NATO, Eastern Ukraine is in Russia, and the Russians and the Americans, who hate each other at that point, are eyeball to eyeball on the Dnieper River. Not a good idea.
Not a good idea at all. But yet that seems to be something closer to what we're at least drifting towards. Do you see anything different today? And do you still stand by those remarks?
Well, I think that if you want to settle this one, if Ukraine wants to settle this one, the sine qua non is it has to become a neutral state. It has to give up not only on entering NATO, it has to sever its security relationship with the West. This war is all about Ukraine entering NATO. The Russians have made it clear that that's an existential threat, and it's not going to happen. So if you want to put an end to the war, you have to go to great lengths to create a neutral Ukraine. And I would note to you, Danny, that if we go back to March 2022, a month after the war started, and the negotiations were taking place in Istanbul, right, between Ukraine and Russia, the key issue on the table from the Russian point of view, and the Ukrainians fully understood this, was Ukrainian neutrality. Ukraine had to give up on joining NATO. It is the core issue. We have never been willing, we meaning the West and especially the United States, have never been willing to accept that.
So let me ask you that before you finish that part there, because I remember I went back and looked at it a couple of days ago, that in the days leading up to those negotiations, Zelensky made a point of publicly saying that I would be willing to at least contemplate a neutral status or whatever. And then, of course, it radically changed after that and never went back. Do you have any sense of what happened between the like a week before and then what happened when they completely changed their minds?
Well, it's quite clear. We don't have all the inside documents, but it's quite clear that Boris Johnson, working with the Americans, told the Ukrainians to walk away from the deal that was being negotiated. There was no final deal. They were pushing towards a final deal. There was a lot of optimism at the time. And we in the West, mainly the United States and the Brits, and of course the United States really matters here, told Zelensky to walk, and he walked. Now the question is why? I believe there were two reasons. One is we thought that the Ukrainian army was doing well enough on the battlefield that it would defeat the Russian army in Ukraine over the course of 2022 with a lot of help from us. So those initial Ukrainian successes on the battlefield around Kyiv gave us lots of confidence in the Ukrainian army. That's point one. Point two is we thought the sanctions would bring the Russians
to their knees.
Right? That's the 1-2 punch. What happens on the battlefield and the sanctions. And of course, as we now all know, the sanctions fail. In fact, they backfire. It's the Europeans.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of the battlefield, as you and I were talking about before, and I thought you put it quite eloquently, what's happened over time is that the Ukrainians have become increasingly weaker vis-a-vis the Russians. So those two operating assumptions that were at play in March 2022 and early April 2022 were proved to be false. And by the way, just to take this one step further, you remember that General Milley in the fall of 2022 called for a settlement, right? This is after the Ukrainians had done quite well on the battlefield. Now, why did Milley say, let's settle now? He understood it was the high water mark. By the fall of 2022, it was quite clear that the sanctions were not working. And furthermore, although the Ukrainians did have the upper hand on the battlefield to some extent, the fact is that Putin was mobilizing the Russian army. Remember, I think it was September 20th of 2022, he mobilized 300,000 Russian troops. And of course, in over the subsequent year, 2023, they've had probably about 450,000 new volunteers added to the Russian military. And I believe this is what Milley foresaw. Milley understood that, Ukraine has done very well up to now, thank you, but this is not going to last forever. We're up against the bear. But Milley was dismissed out of hand because, again, the expert.
And look, John, if I may be willing to concede a fraction of a thought that, okay, I can see where some who maybe don't understand the depth of how combat power is built at the national level may have been tempted to think, okay, well, if their economy collapses and the Ukraine side gets a bunch of stuff, then maybe there is a chance. I can see where that would be. You can't say that anymore. But now then what we see here, and here's our Secretary of State Blinken proving that we don't get any of that now when it's now grossly out of proportion and growing in the opposite direction. He's still saying this. Or he will say it in a minute.
Last week, NATO signed a $1.2 billion contract to produce 220,000 artillery shells. That's going to help allies restock their own arsenals. And it complements efforts by the United States, by the European Union, by Ukraine, to ramp up defense production. This will make NATO itself and all allies much more resilient for future threats as we move forward.
Okay, first of all, let me just talk about the fundamentals of what he said, which is just complete and utter nonsense. 220,000 artillery shells, that's, let's see, I think it was about 12 days worth of normal intensity use of about 7,000 or so shells per day. It'll take 2 years to build that. And he even said some of it's going to go back to NATO countries to replenish what they've lost. Ergo, only a fraction of that would ever possibly get to the Ukraine side. But that's just nonsense to say we're going to do something now that 2 years from now will be a drop in the bucket. They got to survive the rest of this summer. Forget about getting to 2 years from now, but that shows that our leadership is not thinking that way, as well as that clip I showed from the President Biden a few minutes ago.
Yeah, it's hard for anybody who knows anything about conventional war to take what people like the president and the Secretary of State say seriously. I mean, I just wonder what these people know about war. I mean, let's just talk about Ukraine recapturing territory. They tried to do that starting on June 4th of last year with the famous counteroffensive that lasted a number of months. It was a colossal failure. And at the time, everybody said that it would be impossible, if this counteroffensive failed, to ever produce a Ukrainian army that was as potent as that army. Well, first of all, that army was not very potent. It was not well trained. I mean,
It wasn't.
These people think that, you can take people off the street, send them to boot camp for 4 weeks, and then turn them into panzer commanders who are going to sweep across eastern Ukraine. It's just not the way the world works. And if you look at the problem the Ukrainians have, we've been focusing a lot here on weaponry. One could argue that the biggest problem they face now is not so much weaponry, although that's a huge problem, as you just said. It's manpower, right? Yes. They say they need 500,000 troops, new troops, to replace the huge losses. There's no way they're going to get 500,000 troops. And one of the reasons that that doesn't work, I mean, aside from the fact that there will be protests in the streets, is they can't train up and arm 500,000 new troops. They just don't have the capability. I
think I saw, John, that an estimate said that probably the maximum they could possibly get and equip and train is about 220,000 if they can find the manpower. But the 500,000 is not even possible. 220,000 people who basically you can tell them how to hold a rifle and point and shoot, but not actually conduct combat arms operations is meaningless.
Yeah. And by the way, for these people who are talking like Ben Hodges about recapturing territory, going on the offensive and winning, right? Those troops have to be especially well trained, because to launch an offensive on the modern battlefield is a really wickedly difficult enterprise. And not only do they not have the numbers, the Ukrainians, they also are not going to have troops that are well enough trained to do that or have the operational experience.
Yeah, 100% correct. I agree wholeheartedly with that.
Yeah, I keep thinking about the American Army in World War II. We got attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And then in the spring of 42, we sent troops to North Africa. And our first big battle is in Kasserine Pass against the Germans. And the Germans, of course, are battle-tested, first-class fighters when it comes to, modern armored wars. And they're up against Americans who have hardly any training and hardly any battle experience.
Yeah.
Kasserine Pass was a disaster, right? We got much better over time, for sure. But it took a lot of time. And if there's one thing the Ukrainians don't have, it's time. Nope. They also don't have the manpower. But
so getting back to our operational question here, so we agree that there is no path to a victory. So that's not even on the table for discussion. But the question is, what would Ukraine have to do? And by extension, what would the United States have to do to avoid a loss for Ukraine? Because I think, as we're coming to the conclusion here, if we continue on with the fiction, both in Kiev and Washington, the chances are high that Ukraine loses the war, and they don't negotiate out of a position of strength or anything else. They get terms of surrender if it goes on. What could be done to change that dynamic so that Ukraine can avoid losing?
Well, let me make 2 points. First of all, I don't think it can be done. I think when we talk about,
it may already be too late.
It's too late. Yeah, it's too late. The only, as I said earlier on, Danny, the only interesting question at this point is how much territory do the Ukrainians lose? That they're not going to recapture any territory. The question is, can you basically maintain the status quo where the Russians control 4 oblasts or have annexed 4 oblasts plus Crimea, right? And can you prevent the Russians from conquering the next 4 oblasts to the west of the ones that they now have? That's the really key question. And I honestly don't think you can do that, because you cannot redress the imbalance in air power. You cannot redress the imbalance in weaponry, especially artillery. We just don't have the shells and the tubes to give them. And we can't fix the manpower problem, or they can't fix the manpower problem,
Yikes.
as we were talking about, right? That they're just in deep trouble when you look at all the key indicators that determine who wins a war of attrition. And again, to go back to your argument, it only gets wide. The gap between Russian and Ukrainian capabilities only gets wider with the passage of time. So I think it's going to be well nigh impossible. I may be wrong, but well nigh impossible to prevent the Russians from conquering a good swath of additional territory in the western, to the west of the territory that they now control.
You know, I think that the only even theoretical possibility, and I think it actually is a shot, if Zelensky woke up in the morning and said, "This is nonsense." He watches this show, he hears what you say, and finally the truth gets in. Literally every day we wait means we're going to lose more territory and more men. I'm going to start suing for peace tomorrow. Then there might be a chance to hang on to more and not lose any more. I just don't see any possibility that Zelensky will do that, because I think he's locked in that he's going to go until somebody stops him or until, tanks start surrounding the outside of Kiev or something like that. And then he doesn't have a choice. But I really think, and I want to ask you this as we close here, kind of what the best guess is from this point, because there are so many intangibles that you don't know how things are actually going to play out. But from my 2 cents here, I'm starting to see signs that the Ukrainian military is starting to crack. Their confidence in the leadership is badly jarred. And if they keep getting these missions of suicide, trying to do things that can't be done, that the chances of actual breaking are going to increase here, which means this may not go on even much past the summer. That's one possibility here. But the Ukrainians certainly have shown a lot of tenacity, and they may continue to go on further, even in a losing cause. We've certainly seen that in history before. But what is your best projection of what you think is going to happen from here forward, say through the fall?
Well, as you point out, predicting whether or not the Ukrainian army cracks, whether it shatters, whether there are serious mutinies, and they're largely incapable of continuing the fight, is a very tricky business. My sense is that if you look at all the indicators, there is more than an even chance that the army will break, that it will crack, the Ukrainian army. I mean, we talked about some of the big problems surrounding the balance of air power, the balance of ground forces, to include artillery and troops. And there are a number of other factors that are at play here which do not portend well for the Ukrainians. First of all, they now have a commanding general who is deeply disliked by the troops. Furthermore, they have political chaos, and I think it's fair to call it political chaos back in Kyiv. And that means the troops are looking back towards the capital and seeing that people are not united and not united in helping them. Then they look at Washington and they see that the Americans are losing interest in supplying them with weaponry. And even if the Americans do provide another tranche, will they provide the tranche after that? So there are just so many indicators here that point to profound trouble for Ukraine, that you can see them just saying, is it worth sacrificing my life for what is obviously a lost cause? And I think if you look at what happened with the 3rd Assault Brigade in terms of relieving Avdiivka, that's an indicator that there's real potential trouble here. This is an elite brigade that's filled with Azov people, and it's the last kind of brigade you would think would not go into Avdiivka and do its duty. But it basically refused to do its duty. I think they understood, the people in that brigade, that they were walking into a meat grinder and they didn't want to die. So they, in effect, disobeyed orders. And I think this is evidence that things are beginning to come unglued inside of the Ukrainian military. Now, from the distance that you and I are following this, it's hard to be sure, but there is enough evidence out there where you can tell a plausible story about the Ukrainian army.
Yeah.
cracking.
Yeah, in any capacity, in any reading, it's moving in a bad direction, and it's not neutral. And it's just egregious to watch this video like what you're seeing there, where this, buildings are going to continue to get blown up every day. People are going to continue to get killed every day, and it's not going to change the outcome. It's if not foreordained, it's something really close to it. And I just pray for the day that the leaders will finally wake up and do something to stop some of the carnage before before too many more people are pointlessly killed. But that's outside of our power. All we can do is do what we've done here, and we're very grateful to have you on today to come and lay out the truth, because at this channel we remain unintimidated and uncompromised on saying what is true, no matter what anybody likes it or not. And I know this narrative is not chosen by many in Washington, but as you pointed out earlier, many in America, on the other hand, are starting to see this, and I think they're resonating with what their eyes tell them and what they can see in just common sense that seems to elude a lot of official Washington.
Thank you for having me on, Danny.
We appreciate it, and we thank you for coming on. And folks, you're going to want to, on this same topic, this Saturday, we're going to have the Russia-Ukraine war. It's the actual 2-year mark of the war. But we're going to talk about how there's a decade of Western diplomatic failure has led to this. It's not just about what happened since February 2022, but going back a full decade before that. And you may see a cameo appearance by John Mearsheimer in that. So we're looking forward to that. And we will be with you all the way through as these things develop. Be sure to like and subscribe and share with your friends so that they get the kind of information and the quality analysis that you're getting right here. And we'll see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.